Well, I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. We're going to go ahead and get started. There may be some stragglers come in here, but that's all right. We'll still let them in the door. I think we have a very nice program for you tonight. We have a connection here to what used to be old Westfield, the Pioneer days. And we have one of the great-great-great-grandsons, one of the pioneers, to come in here and talk about his grandfather a little bit. He brought in some of the artifacts. I'm going to let him talk about all those. I'm not going to spoil it for you. But first off, Bruce, did you say you wanted to talk about Voices of the Past for a minute? We have a couple announcements, and then we'll get to our presentation.
Thank you. Well, we'll make this brief. We want to thank everyone that supported our second annual Voices from the Past, a project we do with the Westfield Parks Department. Again, very successful this year. It's growing. The exciting thing this year is we had 275 school children from the Washington Township Westfield Elementary schools come. We had them from two elementary schools, the second grade class, and so and it was sold out on Friday and pretty much sold out on Saturday. So. And we get a donation from the Parks Department. Last year we got a donation of $500 to the Society. This year I would suspect it'll be significantly more. And it was great to feature, we did the research on the historical information about 10 individuals that were portrayed by actors in the parks. And so it was really nice. Also, this year, we have to thank Sanders Glen. They provided transportation for those who were not able to get around and walk in the park. It's a walking history tour. And so they had 10 residents that rode on the bus. Well, not residents from there, but 10 individuals. I think 3 of them were from Sanders Glen. Interesting enough, my own mother and my mother-in-law were on the bus, and it was really nice. At the end, there were a number of people that were just tuckered out, so they couldn't get out and go into the last park. So all the actors came on the bus and did their historical sketches on the bus for them, and so it was very nice. And so keep your eyes tuned for that next year. It looks like September is a great time of the year for that, and we're happy to hear any of if you know of people that had good experiences with that, please pass that on to us. We're excited to know more about that. That's all I have.
Thanks, Bruce. Okay, well, our presentation tonight, of course, is on the old gunsmithing of Westfield, and we're lucky to have, like I said, the two great-grandsons, one of the gun makers back in the Pioneer days. Mr. Bob O'Rear is not from Westfield originally. He said he grew up in Indianapolis, but his grandfather and a lot of his relation, of course, lived here. And he told me earlier, he said it was always his dream to build his own home up here, which he's done. So now he is a resident of Washington Township, unless you're just a little bit over the line.
Jackson.
You're in Jackson. Okay, you're just a little bit over the line. Not far. I know where he's at up there, and I thought that line was 216th, isn't it?
It is about 260.
Okay. So anyway, I'm going to let him take over here, and I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about his grandfather and the history of his family and how he ended up, his grandfather being here, and these beautiful guns that he made. So please give a warm welcome to Mr. Bob O'Rear.
Hi. I'm volunteer with this too tonight. I've always been interested in history. My mom was from Sheridan. My dad was from Carmel. And then my grandmothers and great aunts were from Westfield. They were cooks. And so I guess you start up when you're young. When I was about 10 or 12 years old, my grandmother, my great aunt would tell me stories about how my great-great-grandfather made rifles. And I didn't quite understand. I thought they meant in a plant during the Civil War, but he actually made Kentucky-style rifles in a little shop right out here on 31. And most of the information that I've kind of come by was what my grandmothers told me, and then I was fortunate enough to find a a lot of information, at least on Wyatt Perry. He was written up in, there's a book called Gunmakers of Indiana, and they did a nice little story on him. And then I found one little story that's in our Westfield, and that's the story where they used one of his rifles to shoot the last black bear in Washington Township, and I always thought that was an interesting story. And then he was also written up, this is Muzzle Blast Magazine from 1951, and they did a story on him, and they showed the house, and did a nice little story, so it's given me a lot of information. And then this is the best book. This is a portrait and biographical record of Madison and Hamilton County. It's written in 1880. He was still alive. And that's got the main story and everything I've learned about him. It's he lived a long time. He was born in Stokes County, North Carolina, November 28th, 1813. And he lived to 1906. And he died right there in Hortonville at his daughter's house. But when he was born, his father died when he was about 6 weeks old. And then his mother remarried a man named Greenberry Shaw, and he happened to be a gunsmith. So that's how, when Wyatt got old enough, he taught him the trade to be a gunsmith in North Carolina. And then sometime around 1841, Greenberry Shaw wanted to move to Ohio, so they moved to Greene County, Ohio, and they took all the siblings. Of course, Wyatt Perry went, and he was about 17 years old. And he was still training then, probably in that time period, to make rifles as an apprentice. And then somewhere in there, I guess just a few years, maybe 4 years after that, in 1841, Greenberry Shaw died. So Wyatt Perry was probably looking for a better place to live. I don't know how the pioneers did, but just before 1850, he moved to Westfield. And of course, he bought 70 acres out here. It's right there at 203rd and 31. He lived on the east side of the road, and just to the south of 203rd. They tore the house down, the barn. There's still an entry wood there. But it said in the books that when he moved here, he devoted his full time to gunsmithing, and he hired people to farm the land, 70 acres. And he had married a woman named Nancy Lee in Ohio, and they had 11 children. And I believe it says that, and they lost a lot of children back then. I think it said all but 5 of them survived. And then in 1861, Nancy Lee died, and he married Catherine Bray. And there's a lot of the Bray family from around this area. And she bore 4 children. And so he had a lot of children. But everything I found out about him, he was probably pretty strict. He said he was tall, lightly built, wore a full white beard, and said that he was pretty strict in business manners. It says one time in here that when his wife died in 1861, he stopped the funeral procession until he settled up with the undertaker, which I thought that was a little strange. He evidently was pretty strict in business. But I don't know how many rifles he made in his time period. I don't have any idea. I found one other rifle in the community around Westfield here that a man has. I have one, and there's a man in Illinois that I found. And I know he was pretty strict. My grandmother, when she was a little girl, when the cousins would stay at the house, at his house, they probably stayed overnight, she had a scar on her forehead. And I guess the kids were all cutting up and wouldn't go to sleep. He came upstairs and he took a ramrod out of a rifle and he slammed it down on the bed to tell him to go to sleep. And he hit my grandmother in the forehead. She always had a little scar there, or he'd smacked her on the head. But they said in his last days, I mean, you know, he lived about 93 years old. He liked to sit on the back porch of his house with 3 or 4 loaded rifles, and when any hawk, squirrel, or crow, whatever came close, he liked to shoot. So that's how he spent his days in Westfield. But other than what I told you right there, I can answer questions, but a lot of things, of course, he died before my father was born. My father was born in 1909, and Wyatt Perry died in 1906. So everything I learned was basically through my grandmother and great aunts. This is a picture of him. I had this made years ago off the tintype up here. You can kind of see what he looked like. That's what the pioneers, you know, the way they were. And he's buried. There's a small cemetery there on 203rd, just back to that'd be to the east. And there's not a lot of people buried in there, and it's kind of in bad shape, but he's buried right there. So, if you got any questions, I can field questions for you. Yeah.
Is there any identifying marks on his rifles, or how do you?
Yeah, it's signed right on the barrel in script. Usually if a gun maker was fairly proud of his work, that was the way he advertised. And it's in script. Now later on, a lot of gunsmiths stamped their names with a stamp. But his is actually engraved in script, and it says W. Perry. And some of his rifles, I haven't seen them, but they said he also marked them down here on the trigger guard, just WP. But that's what I found, is that way. That's a really long rifle. It's a 45-inch barrel, and it's 60 inches long. So it's a pretty tall rifle. I mean, you can take a look and see how long those were. And the Pioneers must have been pretty hardy at that time, because it's the iron in that, it's heavy, and you can see how tall it is. It's a big one. But I thought that entry in the Westfield book on it was Mr. Bray. Now, I don't know if that was Malcolm Bray or Henry Bray.
It was Henry Bray, but
Henry probably at that time.
Yeah.
But he killed the last black bear in Washington Township. Most people wouldn't even dream there would have been a bear left in Washington Township.
Here comes
Mr. Bray.
Mr. Bray here. Maybe you could ask him which Bray that would have been.
Yeah.
Good comment.
I might mention that cemetery is officially Pleasant View Methodist Cemetery, but a lot of people call it Perry's Cemetery, maybe because
and that's in the book. He was a Methodist. Yes.
But the other thing is, the area there that's shown for the property ended up being Sumner property, and it's like Joe Sumner lived there.
Uh-huh.
I can remember in my school class at Westfield, there was a Charles Sumner, which probably was
I was trying to think if it was Lance Sumner or Joe. I talked to one of them there at the house years ago.
Anyway, there was one room at the Westfield Library that's dedicated as a Sumner room, and there's been a lot of history written on both Sumners and Moores since there was some intermarriage.
Yeah.
And they were from the Hortonville area.
Right. Yeah, you can imagine, but at that Pioneer time period, I think they married, what was closest to them right here in Westfield at those time periods.
Especially if they had been married 2 times or so forth.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Bray here, Bill Bray, just came in. He's related to of course, is Catherine Bray.
Mm-hmm.
He was just telling me that his brother has, or one of his family members perhaps, has the tooth out of that bear.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he had, my dad carried that bear tooth for years, and then Malcolm got it. And I don't know whether he gave it to Alice. He might have given that to Gray. I can't tell you what happened. He had that bear tooth and carried it for years, so. Whether Alice or,
Yeah.
I don't know.
And you say Henry Bray was your
Grandmother.
great
Right,
grandfather.
that would make sense, yeah. I've got entries for Henry Bray in this book up here. This is evidently what the general store that they owned around here. I've got entries for Wyatt Perry, what he bought, and I think there's entries for Henry Bray in there. So it's really interesting to see, they lived off the land, and when they went into town, they didn't buy a whole lot, but it looks to me like they bought calico and things to make dresses, and they bought boys' boots. They must have went through boots a lot.
Bob, you talked about, they said they bought powder and shot
Mm-hmm.
and cats. And one of the references in the old our Westfield book was that back in the early days, the squirrels were so thick here, they couldn't grow a crop because they'd eat it up.
Yeah.
So they kept extra shot and powder at the store, and I guess that was one of the favorite pastimes, was shooting squirrels.
Yeah, well, I know, I read a story one time in 1811, there was a flood of squirrels. They swam the Ohio River. They came across from Kentucky, and they devastated a lot of the crops. But yet, it is amazing. They bought tobacco, so evidently the men liked their tobacco, and they bought their caps and their powder and things. But boy, it looks to me like they lived pretty lean. They didn't buy a lot. They didn't waste money.
Where were those products made? Was there an armory or a military supply house that had the powder?
I don't know where a general store bought that or where they got it. They bought bar lead too. They bought lead to make their balls with, to melt them.
Now you have some interesting tools down there. Can you
Yeah.
tell us about some of those?
They had
Well-
my chaps from
This is, I didn't get a lot of things passed down through my family. I did get this. This was from my great aunt, and that's a bullet ladle. And this is what they would dip into the hot lead. And then you had a bullet mold, and you would take the hot lead and you poured it down into the bullet mold, and then when it cooled, you could open it up and drop the ball out. But just a few things there. This is a small wooden tool with a very sharp end on it. It's kind of an awl, but it's very heavy, and I suppose they could either work on the wood for doing some of the woodwork that they did on the rifle. And then this is a deer's foot. I'm sure if the bears were around, the deer was plentiful. I'm sure that Wyatt Perry, they had other ways to make money, but this is a pin cushion. And so they took the deer hoof and then they kind of dressed it out. It looks like a shoe, a colonial shoe from that time period. But that was all of Wyatt Perry's time period there. And then if you had a rifle, you had to have a bag and a horn to go with it. And I just have these things up here so I could show you. But usually you would have your powder horn and your shot pouch. And you always had a charger to fill your barrel with. But those things always had to go with your rifle.
Would that have been a pouch and so forth from the Civil War?
No, it's actually more of a hunting pouch. It's not military. It's probably not strong enough to hold up for the Civil War. It's more of a hunter's pouch that you take to the woods.
Yeah, I know I have some of my ancestors' Civil War items, and it's like their pouches really weren't very much. I don't know whether it varied from unit to unit for the Indiana infantry or not, but some of it was really poorly made in my estimate.
Yeah.
It's like one like that would have been a lot more sturdy.
Yeah.
Do you know where the major foundry was that they poured to make their barrels?
They bought, the early gunsmiths in Pennsylvania and some of Ohio, they actually forged their own barrels. But I think at the time period when Wyatt Perry was making rifles in 1830s, 1840s, that they were buying barrels. And you could buy barrels and you could buy locks from out east, from Pennsylvania. And so then he might buy a barrel and rifle it himself, you know, if he wanted it to be a 36 or a 34 caliber. But there's a lot of barrel makers. I've got books that show that they supplied them, so back east.
Well, I know during the Revolutionary War times, they used a flintlock. And of course, later on, flintlock was not adequate for fighting. Even by the time of the Civil War, I was reading where a lot of people were converting them over from a flintlock to a ball and cap. And of course, ball and cap had its problems because I'd heard about people forgetting it. And in the process of the battle, they didn't get their plunger out of the barrel or something, and they shot it away, so then they didn't have them anyway to
Be in trouble.
reload it.
Well, I've always imagined that Wyatt Perry, for the time period, that Flint period is from the Revolutionary War period clear through to about 1833, and then they started converting guns and started making percussion guns, took a cap. But I imagine he was trained up under Greenberry Shaw, and he probably made some flintlocks, I would imagine, early. And then his later guns in the 1840s and 50s, they were all percussion. Yeah.
I'm kind of intrigued by a couple of things. You mentioned that that's a Kentucky-style rifle. And of course, I suspect, when Kentucky and some of those started to really be oversettled, the North Territory here in Indiana, the Indian Territory, became very attractive on lower of the Wabash River. But very important to coming and settling this, as everyone would have had to have a rifle, because the meat through the game was what really sustained in those first couple decades. So I'm interested in a little more definition of a Kentucky rifle, what it's
Well, actually, I think you might have heard me say, Indiana was the 4th largest gun-producing state.
Okay.
And it ranks Pennsylvania's first and Ohio. I believe it's Maryland. And actually, Kentucky, it's the style rifle is what they call a Kentucky-style rifle. And that actually came out of when Andrew Jackson fought with a lot of the Kentuckians at the Battle of New Orleans, and they called them Kentucky rifles.
Is it more?
But actually, there wasn't a lot of Kentucky gun makers. That's just the style.
Is the style more? That's what I mean.
A squirrel rifle, but this certain style, and there's a few characteristics on this that I've learned. North Carolina was known for a real long tang, and that's this metal piece that comes back to here. And I've got a lot of Indiana guns, and they have a much shorter tang. But this probably is the influence that he gained out of North Carolina. So there's probably a few things there. And then the other thing I thought was unique, and it's the only rifle, I collect rifles. It's got a little brass inlay. It's a fish. That's the sign of a Christian. So evidently he put that on his rifles, and that's the only one I've ever seen. So I thought that was kind of unique.
The other question is this Greenberry, what was the last name?
Greenberry Shaw.
Greenberry Shaw and Wyatt Perry. Why, those names have some literary glitter to them. Those are kind of interesting names. Any story on those names with it?
I don't know. I know more about Wyatt Perry and his parents and his grandfather. They had a large, I don't know if you call it a farm or estate in North Carolina. And he said his grandfather was known for making peach brandy, which that would make sense before 1813 if you're around 1775 and right after that he was known for his peach brandy there in North Carolina. And the name Greenberry Shaw, I haven't found much on that, because the other thing is he had to make a lot of rifles too. And I've asked a lot of people, and I've never found one of his rifles or a picture of it. And I've got a lot of books. There's a lot of books that are written, Pennsylvania books in Ohio, and he doesn't show up in those.
Now, going back to the Sumner name, and Joe Sumner, some of his generation, two different generations had Greenberry Sumner.
Huh.
His father's name was Greenberry. Joe Sumner's father was.
But then also, I think his great-grandfather maybe was Greenberry.
And I do know that the families like to pass down those first names a lot. They keep showing up, repetition.
Do you know which area in North Carolina they were from?
No, I thought it'd be fun to go on vacation down there and take a look, but I've never went down there.
It'd be kind of interesting if they came from a similar area as a lot of the Westfield founders came from.
Yeah, there's a lot of people from Westfield that all came from the North Carolina area.
Yeah, but which part?
My
would be interesting.
mother's mother was a Sumner, and some of that family started Hinkle Friends Church 175 years ago, and they come from the area of where my grandparents came from. Center Friends Church in Guilford County, North Carolina. Of course, Matthew Osborne II was one of the founders of that, as long as with John Bales.
I'd like to know more about Catherine Gray. That's who his second wife was, Wyatt Perry. Married her in 1861. And I think it says, think it says that her father was Henry. Does that sound right? It's,
I'm not,
I'm not sure. It's,
yeah. What'd you say, who'd you say he's married to?
he married Catherine Bray in 1861 after his wife died.
Well, now, I don't,
Which spelling of Catherine is that? Is that C or K?
I'll make sure I'm telling you right here. Got Catherine with a C, daughter of Henry and Anna Bray.
okay, well, all right.
I don't-
One that died before, I guess. You, excuse me, going back, you talk about Greenberry Sumner, would that be the same? We had a man in the neighborhood that was called Green Sumner, would that be the same person, Greenberry?
His name was Shaw. His last name was Shaw.
Oh.
His stepfather.
Do you know who, you said he had 11 children,
Mhm.
and I don't know if I misunderstood, but 5 were left, or?
He had, the first wife bore 11 children, and I think it said 6 had died. He had 5 out of that, and one of them is my great-grandmother, Emily Cook, and she married Silas Cook. They lived right here at Westfield. And he had a son, Jonathan. I think I've heard from my family that he was killed in the Civil War. And then there's one of the Perrys was a minister. But and I know that the names are interesting. Some of the daughters' names were Alameda. Is his name? Marissa is one of them.
Do you know if there are any of the boys' families still living?
No,
Still around here?
there's no Perrys around here that are related because I've tried to find out as much as I could about the family. One of the sons moved to Danville and then on to California. I did meet one of his grandsons here in Westfield about 25 years ago. I think his name was Perry Rich, and I think he'd worked with the church all his life, and he was pretty old when I talked to him. And I think he said that it was kind of a sad story. He said that his mother had died, and his father had remarried when he was a little boy. He came home from school one time, and all the pictures of the family that he had, and Wyatt Perry and all them, she was outside burning them all in a trash fire. So he was kind of interesting. But he said he knew one story. He said Wyatt Perry, one time somebody came in his shop, which it was been a very small shop right there on 31, and he was talking to him, and he opened the wood box up to get something out. Of course, those people were pretty tough then. He said that there was a mouse in there, it bit him on the finger. Said he didn't pull back or anything, he just reached in, squeezed him to death, and he said, "That'll teach you." I got that story, and then the one where my grandmother's scar on her forehead. That's
Do you know where they lived in Hortonville?
now he died there in Hortonville. His actual farm with the gunsmith shop is right down here in 31. That's my great grandmother's house in Hortonville is where he died in 1906. And there is a little house there. I've got pictures of it, and it's still there. I was trying. Hortonville's not very big. Let's see. If you're going straight west, kind of right in the middle of town there, before you get to the four-way stop, back just to the north, there's a few houses that kind of sit back in there. There's a little lane, and there's a house back there. It's still there.
You know, a lot of that was up Roberts Avenue, and early on, it's like Hortonville had their depot for the Monon, what became the Monon Railroad there. Also, they had a post office that lasted until sometime in the 1920s, I think, maybe early 1930s. But we figure in later years, there were several different Roberts families lived up on the west side of the road there. Plenty Roberts and I forget who all was. Plenty's brother and some of the others.
Go ahead.
Now, when you mentioned that you say he lived on, what was it, 203rd, So when you say 31, 31 wouldn't have really been there, it was more
Yeah,
the field.
I talked to Jim about that.
Yeah, I'm curious about that.
Now, I always thought that 31 probably was I thought maybe it was an old road that went north. But evidently it's not, but that's, the picture they took from Muzzle Blast magazine in 1951, that shows his driveway there, which he was gone a long time. But, so I don't know where his drive would have come in off of 203rd Street, you suppose?
I believe after the meeting, we have a map up here. It's a 1866 map of Hamilton County. And we've got Washington Township superimposed over what is now the city limits of Westfield. And it shows Bob's great-great-grandfather's property, and it labels it as a gunsmith. And you'll be able to notice the road. The original road back in those days, if you remember the road story, how the roads escaped the slave hunters as they went to Westfield. Well, you'll notice that road, when it intersected State Road 38 and Anthony, swang through the field and kind of hooked up with Flippin's Road. Grassy Branch Road was not there in 1866. So you'll be able to notice how it also branched off and went down 202nd, took the jog, went to 203rd, and then you'll be able to see your grandfather's place there. And the road actually crossed and went across what we now consider 31 and up the hill toward Hortonville. And you'll be able to notice that on the map. So 31, back in the very early days, I don't believe existed.
Wasn't it even range line? No.
Well, originally it was called Lick Road, or
That's
Black.
Lick
It was
Creek.
originally called White Lick or something.
Lick Creek?
Lick Creek was on there.
Well, that's on one of the other maps in 1870 that Mike pulled up.
Well, if we look at the map that's on the back side of the paper today, for the one map there.
That's
well,
1870.
and see, at that time, the road off of what the date, 1931, or US 31 didn't come into existence until in the 1920s, when they concreted it and came through Westfield on Range Line Road. But prior to that time, it was called US 1. But I don't know that it was a road that you could have got through except in the driest conditions.
Probably.
I think Phil Bray can tell you a little bit more about that.
31 for about 4 miles north, and it's still up there next to the Pierce Oil Parks. It's still marshy. 31 was marshy all the way, wet marshy all the way up to there. And that's why they had used the Shud Pike and went out the Flint Road and went up Anthony Road. And they're on where Roy Woods owns. I don't know who owns it now. But it's been within my lifetime, they hooked a plow on the back of their tractor, and they caught a part of corduroy road, the log went all the way in on the end of the plow, and the plow broke loose from the tractor, and they dug that log out, and it was part of the corduroy road.
Yeah, I knew that's how they built their roads.
But this 1870,
South of the woods up there on the Grassy Branch, just to the west of the road.
My
If you-
dad used to tell me about the building of Highway 31, north, at least north of the Horton Road, that they would cut trees down from our woods, and they would put them like this across, and then they'd go back and put them like this across, and they'd wait a little bit of time because it would sink right down because there was quicksand through the
Yeah, in the swamp.
Then they'd come back and they'd lay another layer and another layer, and
Wow.
they'd wait some time. They kept doing that until it would hold a little bit. But if you'll notice, even when they went through with the new the southbound to make it 4-lane, they had a terrible time in getting that to hold. And every year they would come through and put blacktop on that. So the bottom of the hill used to be down where the ditch is.
Mhm.
And now if you'll notice, it's almost
It
up to
is.
Horton, up to the Horton Road. And even in building the road right now that they're working on, they, what do you call those pilings that they drill down into the ground? Well, they thought they had them down good enough and they laid it, and then they have to go back and redo them, and put them down deeper because it still was not holding.
That's why it's not finished up now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess my original question that would lead to, really hit, I suppose I surmise then by deduction that on his property, he must have had what you would call a small shop
Yeah.
that he worked out of, and his name then probably carried around, and people would probably come from miles around to have him.
Yeah, he would either work, you imagine, he was probably the only one, in my book on the Indiana gunsmiths, there's no gunsmiths at Carmel. There's none at Sheridan. And there is some mention at Noblesville. They're a little bit later, actually, it gets into around 1880. But, so he would have been the early pioneer gunsmith. So he would have done repairs if somebody had a gun that needed a new nipple put on it or the drum rusted out. And that was a lot of things that happened to those old guns. If they set and they had powder down there in the back of the barrel, right at the breech, they rusted out. So I imagine he did a lot of repairs. It could be a lot of his work was on repairs, and maybe he couldn't, I don't know how much time he had to devote to making rifles. So, yeah.
Why did they have to make the barrel so long? Was there a reason for it?
They're rifled, that's rifled, and the longer the barrel, the more it imparts a spin to the bullet. And they made a lot of shorter guns too. That just happens to be a very long gun. But it would probably shoot really straight. That would be one of the reasons, because it would have much longer room as that ball is spinning through there to keep it going straight.
But you figure there were a lot of what you might call amateur gun makers.
Mhm.
They only maintained and kept their own gun, and even maybe made their own powder. I know one of my great uncles, supposedly it's like he had I think a shotgun, and he got his saltpeter
Yeah.
out of under the buildings and so forth, where set under the building for a long time. Well, it would generate this saltpeter, and he'd skim that off, put it with sulfur, and anyway, I know that he talked about, and he told some of the nephews and so forth, that it's like he shot at a squirrel, and the powder charge was so light that it just maybe got the ball out of the end of the barrel.
Yeah. They had special ways of testing powder back then. They had a little gun that they set up, and they put a powder charge in it, and it had a wheel on it. It would tell you how strong the powder was or if it was weak. I've seen them. I don't own one. But, yeah. Did you have a question?
Well, I think you'd have to be a pretty good shot in those days, because if you were shooting at an animal and you missed him the first time, he'd be long gone.
Yeah. You got, if you were trying to shoot a deer or the black bear, you got one shot, and it takes quite a while to reload it. But in the Civil War, like he was talking about, they had to be able to load their rifle 3 times in a minute. Of course, they were drilled at that, but that takes just a little while. It doesn't take very long to put it. It takes a little longer with the rifling in there. When you put the ball down it, it goes down fairly tight, and usually you've got a patch with it too, but less than a minute.
So you've shot that gun?
No, I've come close. The guns I shoot, they're muzzle loaders. I've come real close to shooting that, and I've never done it. Although one of the rifles that I did find and talk to a man in Illinois, he shoots that one. It's a Wyatt Perry rifle.
But you know, maybe this is not an appropriate question. You don't have to answer it. I'm curious, sometimes the value, appraised value, can demonstrate how good the person was. Are they?
Well, I collect muzzle loading rifles, so I've collected since I got out of the Army in 1972. So they've steadily gone up. You used to be able to buy rifles for $300 and $400 and $500, $600, and now for a rifle similar to this, it's going to be around $8,000 to $1,000.
You were talking about the animal running away after you shot, but I read history about pioneers in Tipton County, originally around Tipton area. And it's like, this is in the time when it was first being settled, maybe in the 1840s. Anyway, this individual went out for water and so forth, and he'd taken his dog along with him, and anyway, a pack of wolves descended on him. He shot one time, got the wolf, but the rest of the pack come on him, and he used the gun as a battering ram to beat the wolves off, and with the help of the dog, he managed to get back to his cabin.
Yeah, that's one of the things I found in the guns I collect. They had a hard life. I've got a lot of guns that are broken at the wrist, and they'll be put back together by a gunsmith if it's a bad job, it's got nails in it. But a lot of times they're wrapped with brass right here, and then they'll have screws in it to hold it back together. And they're tight. They'll do a good job. But I imagine that was after they had their one shot, and like you said, then they used it as a club, and that's where they're always broken, right there at the wrist.
The other guns you saw, that the same Wyatt Perry made, were they the same length, the same style?
No. The one gun I saw in this community was a little shorter, and it has a WP instead of the full name,
Okay.
W. Perry on the top. It has a WP engraved on the barrel. And the other one that the man has in Illinois, I think it has a WP, but from what I understood, I believe it's underneath here engraved on the brass trigger guard.
Did the other ones have the fish as well?
The one I saw here locally did not. It was in kind of bad repair. It didn't have a fish on it, and I don't know about the one in Illinois.
And did you get this through family, or did you?
No, I got the pictures, my pictures and my tintypes, and this and my ladle all came from my great aunt. But I had to track down a rifle. There was no rifles left in the family, and the man that had that lived in Iowa.
Wow.
So I figured that was the pioneers as they were moving west. Maybe they were going to Montana or Utah, California. In the 1840s, 1850s, they probably bought a rifle off of Wyatt Perry and they carried it west.
Yep.
Well, even here, for example, Ambrose Osborne left Westfield after he helped settle it and went to Iowa. So,
Okay.
and he had relatives, his wife had relatives that went there, and they lived here. And so that would, you could suggest perhaps that there's a reasonable reason why that rifle ended up there. Not only just maybe, they probably were going to Iowa to help because they were Quakers. That was another settlement that a number of Quakers from this area helped settle because they were also associated with, in Quaker organization, they have a yearly meeting that is kind of so the Western yearly meeting actually was affiliated with some areas in Iowa, some settlements there, and so maybe that would explain how your gun got to Iowa. That'd be interesting to see.
Those things traveled west. I think one of Wyatt Perry's daughters married a Moore, which that name shows up a lot around here. I think one of them married a Coffin. And Coffins lived right there on the corner at 203rd Street. I'm trying to think what some of the other, there's a lot of other names that I've seen in there, but there's no surviving family left that I know of.
It's funny, Bob, you talk about who they married. It seems like when you put the names to who they married, they were all real close.
Oh, yeah.
The Brays, the Coffins,
Yeah.
so on and so forth.
You
They
evidently married people from your community.
Mm-hmm.
So
Almost
it's
neighbors.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I had one question for Phil Braid. He may not be able to answer it. Phil, do you know where your great-grandfather killed the last bear in Washington Township?
No, I really don't know. I heard Roy kill his deer until that time, and where he killed the bear, I have no idea. I don't know if I ever heard a story about that.
Okay.
You know, somehow or another, I picked that story up. I thought it was out here close to the barn on
Well,
38 where the Bray Farm was
That's
at.
where the deer was killed. I had put it out.
Mhm.
Where Malcolm lived, in the field north of the house, the deer, my grandfather, or great grandfather, I guess, was across, maybe, I don't remember who. But anyway, he heard him yelling one day, and he went over there, and this is in the fall of the year, but I right down, and they chopped corn, corn chop. And I've never I've always wondered whether to believe this story or not. But anyway, he went over there, found that deer. He was holding the deer's horns around the fodder shop. And I never heard of a deer attacking a man. But anyway, he said my grandfather shot that deer, and because my great uncle was yelling, help. And he took his rifle and went over there, and that's what he found.
And that's why most of those rifles got in bad repair, because they left them loaded, and that black powder draws moisture right down there in the breech, and that's where they rusted out. And a lot of the old guns are shorter than this one, because as they went through different families, your son inherited it. If they rusted out there, they used to cut the barrel off, and they rethreaded the breech. They would cut out an inch of bad barrel, and then they had to shorten the whole gun up. And that's a lot of the guns are shorter, but they didn't start out in life that way. They were longer.
What caliber is this?
That's about a 34.
34
It's
caliber.
big enough for deer or squirrel, things like that.
You were talking about Iowa and the settlement of it. Well, you probably remember it from your history. There was the Black Hawk War, and Abraham Lincoln had some involvement with that. And it's like, I know there were people that initially settled Iowa. They went in there, and the Indians went on the warpath, and so the people would, even though they had entered land there in Iowa, they'd come back for a little while and live at their in the area they originally were from. When the Indians settled down, well, they went back to Iowa again.
That would make sense.
No more questions?
I have a question. Am I related to Mr. Bray?
Well, let's see. Catherine Bray, you would probably be related then on my grandmother's side of the family, I guess.
I don't know, they said Henry Bray had about 11 children. And my grandfather I've only heard of 5. Anna Cox was one, and then there was Albert and W.C., which was my grandfather. And I thought there was supposed to be 4 boys and 1 girl.
Yeah, it says in the book that Catherine Bray's father was...
Well, she was one that evidently died before my
Yeah.
father was.
Yeah. Well, Wyatt Perry outlived both of his wives. Yeah. And I don't know exactly when Catherine Bray died, but she died before he did, his second wife.
Was she buried in the same cemetery? you think?
Yeah, it's kind of a shame. The markers that they had there in the cemetery, instead of being stone, were real unique. They were his marker had 2 pieces of brass that came up out of the stone on the bottom. It was about this tall and about this wide. It had clear glass in the front and the back. And when I was a boy, it had paper inside there. It was all in script. It had the dates they were born and the children and everything. And sometime before I got drafted in the Army, somebody had shot through the glass. It lasted that long, if you think about it.
Oh, really?
They'd shot through the glass with a rifle, and of course then moisture started going in it, And then I've been over there and looked at it since then. There's really nothing left of the glass or the paper. I think there might be a little bit of that brass I can find.
There's not many markers left in that cemetery at all anymore.
No, there's not.
Very
few. And I wondered how many people, I think it was all documented, but I kind of wondered how many people were buried in there and how many of Wyatt Perry's children would be buried there.
That's maybe one thing I want to say in general about cemeteries.
Well, there was a church there that shows on the map too.
I had, one of the stories in my family was that Wyatt Perry had donated the ground for that church here too.
More than likely did.
But I knew there wasn't any church left there.
Yeah, there was one at one time, in 1866 it was there, it shows on the map. But I don't know when it went away, and I always heard it was still connected to the Hortonville Methodist. But we have a gentleman in our organization, his name is Gene Cordell. I will give you his number, and as far as your genealogy, he's the guy to talk to. He'll be able to tell you how you're related and whom you're related to, because he has all of Westfield's genealogy.
Well, that's be interesting.
Yeah, he's really well versed in it, and he has it all on the computer file.
I am surprised in that book. There's a lot of settlers in there. I mean, that's a lot of people. In that 1856, 1857 time period, that's a lot of people for a small community.
That has to be Westfield, because in that time period,
Didn't travel.
as far as I know, there was nothing around here.
Well, they wouldn't travel very far, I'm sure.
And the Bray is always in the book. It talks about going and walking to Westfield to buy shoes for the boys.
Yeah.
There's a couple of stories in there about them walking through David Stocker's woods, which was just the other side of the Bray farm. So I imagine that book, without a doubt, is one of the stores in Westfield. It would not have been Asa Bales' store, as he died in 1845.
Okay.
But wasn't it Nathaniel Parker that took over Bales' store? Help me out here, Stuart. Was it?
It was the adopted, not really adopted son, but it was their apprentice that they brought with, that they knew in South Carolina or North Carolina. I can't remember his name, but it's something like that, yeah.
Yeah, I think he took the store over, so maybe if his name shows up in there, you might be able to tell if that's his book. Because that's interesting to me. I didn't know that existed.
Yeah, I've got that one, and then the other book is a little more legible. It's from 1860, and it's in much better shape than this one.
There's no name in the front of it?
No,
who it
I've
was.
looked at that. Yeah, the only thing, there's some cardboard it's kind of looks like it's leather bound or parchment, and in the first page, it's kind of peeled away. There's another paper in there that held the shape, and it's got something to do with it's 1840, and it's talking about the first armories for Indiana, for guns, and it's talking about they needed to build a log cabin armory. They said for $1,000 it would. It's all printed, but it said that should suffice for the money and everything. I thought, well, that's kind of interesting.
Well, didn't Connor, didn't William Connor he was commissioned to build an armory, which would have been a storehouse for the black powder and supplies. I think that he was commissioned to do that by the newly formed county commission when they were forming that in 18.
That would make sense.
Or no, 18, that would have been later than that. But yeah, I think he had that assignment. I'm wondering if that's kind of interesting.
There were a lot of things back in those days that they put into place that we really don't think about today. One of them was every community had to have a health officer back in the day, and usually, of course, it was the town doctor. And we have some of those books from the turn of the century, and of course, it has the doctor that was in charge at that time, and it's pretty neat to look through that. They didn't have a whole lot going on. They did have one murder, and he has that in the entry there, the man's name and so on, and cause of death, gunshot. So, but yeah, back in those days, you might have a book that has reference to something like that in front of it. Very well could have been. Any more questions?
Well, you mentioned that photograph there was a blow up of a tin type. it's like the style of it is a lot like some of the photographs they had for William Connor.
Yeah.
Whether the people that were professional photographers had a studio that, now that's from Civil War era.
Yeah, this has got a stamp on the back of it. Evidently, they had to pay a certain amount just to obtain a tintype. But that's the picture I took it off of. That's him and his wife.
So is the wife, is that the one that's the brave or the?
First one.
Well, it may be the first one, Nancy Lee, because it was taken around the Civil War. Well, and he remarried in 1861, which is the start of the Civil War. But I think it's his first wife.
Is that the case gutta percha?
Yeah.
It's hard rubber.
The black. Yeah.
And then you figure that was really common for soldiers' photographs during the Civil War times.
Anybody else? Well, I'd like to give Bob a real round of applause. Really, it's not too often we get somebody that brings in a piece of history from the beginnings of this community like he did tonight, and that's a real treat. Yeah, Steve?
I think we ought to give his daughter a plug since she has a business here.
Well, I was going to do that. Okay. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell everybody what you've been doing?
Okay. Well, first off, my name is Erin O'Rear, and it sounds like I'm related to a lot of you in here. So I opened up the Wandering Peacock right next to the Historical Society. It's the one with the purple columns and the teal windows. And my vision, I'm a potter, so I have clay all over me. But I kind of have, artwork of everything. So if you want to have some candles, or if you want to have some crafts jewelry, all from Central Indiana artists, come into my shop and I'll make you feel welcome.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's great.
We've talked about, I know I'm interested in maybe offering during the summer some, maybe your help, that you're our next door neighbor, maybe a children's history craft experience, or maybe some of our members could sign up their grandkids or kids to come in and sign. Maybe we do a partnership where you help them make something historical, like a little lamp or something on a
I
pole.
would love that. You know what we could, I don't know, just right off the top of my head, you could make a little pinch pot candle holder from like the Pioneer days, where they have to hold, and we could supply tall candles for them, and then they get to just walk away with something really cute.
Yeah, we should discuss that. I think that'd be a win-win for both of us.
Absolutely.
Do you have a website and Facebook? And
I do. I have a Facebook fan page. It's called The Wandering Peacock, and not a website yet, and I'm not really computer savvy myself. But the Wandering Peacock got its name from the Art Nouveau time period, with the peacock with Tiffany's lamps and kind of everything, the women's rights that were kind of popping up. And I'm a traveler, I'm a nomad, so that's where the wandering came from. So.
Do you make pie birds?
I'm sorry?
Would you make pie birds?
Hyber.
Oh, yeah, I know
Pie birds?
I just recently heard what they are.
I don't know what that is.
A pie bird is a bird or a vent that you put in the center of a
Pie crust.
of a pie, like a fruit pie, and it lets the steam go up out of it and keeps it from the pie overflowing in the oven.
See, I don't know how to bake. I would have never thought that. But yeah, if it's just a cylinder, or is it just more of a cylinder?
It's
type?
shaped
No.
like a bird.
Shaped like bird.
I have,
They're
yeah.
kind of cute. A lot of figurines.
Anything.
I will YouTube that and I will make that for you. I will make you a pie bird.
Well, actually, those are getting to be very collectible. Very,
And I
very
will
collectible.
definitely make you a pie bird.
And
it's
it's
on
on
the
the top.
Mhm.
You go down there and they have, they're not cheap. And they're really, some of them are vintage. If you go on eBay and you look on eBay, some of them are $50 and $65 and they're just about that tall or maybe that big around. But what you do, you secure it around the piper, and all the steam comes out. It will be like a bird with his mouth every little
I love that. I will make that for you.
Never have heard of it.
You can even pick out the color. Well, I have a lot of blue.
Well, thank you.
Oh, thank you.